Part 1, The Invitation. It was supposed to be a simple dare, a night of teenage rebellion. A group of 7, bound by boredom and bravado, planned to break into the old Whitmore house. The mansion had loomed over the town for decades, its windows dark, its stories darker. People disappeared in that house. Locals whispered tales of those who went inside and never returned. Some said they could still hear faint screams echoing through its walls late at night. The police investigated time and again but found no trace of the missing, no bodies, no clues. Just an unsettling emptiness that seemed to mock their efforts. Jacob, the self-appointed leader of their ragtag group, was the first to suggest it. His eyes gleamed with reckless excitement as he gathered the others, Emma, Lucas, Sarah, Maya, Ben, and Kelly, at their usual hangout spot by the train tracks. "Think about it," he grinned, flipping his lighter on and off. "We go in, spend the night, and come out legends. Everyone will be talking about us." "I don't know," Emma said, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What if something goes wrong? We could get arrested." Ben chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll be fine. Cops stopped bothering with that place years ago." Lucas stayed quiet, his gaze locked on the mansion's silhouette in the distance. He wasn't as eager as the others, but the thought of being left out gnawed at him. Not wanting to seem weak, he forced a smile and nodded. "All right, I'm in." Maya and Kelly exchanged glances. Maya was always up for a challenge, while Kelly, though hesitant, didn't want to appear cowardly. The group dynamic was fragile. Sarah, however, was the wild card, the only one who seemed truly excited. She thrived on chaos and unpredictability, her dark sense of humor masking something deeper, something almost broken. "Great!" Jacob clapped his hands together, the sound echoing through the empty field. "We meet tomorrow at midnight. Bring flashlights, phones, and whatever else you need. Let's see if the ghost stories are real." The next night, the 7 teens stood in front of the Whitmore house. It towered above them like a decaying giant, its wooden frame creaking in the wind. The front door, heavy with age, seemed to sag under its own weight, as if inviting them in. As they stepped closer, the air grew colder, unnaturally so, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum thrummed beneath the night. "Let's get this over with," Maya said, her voice tight with a mix of excitement and fear. The front door groaned as Jacob pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the smell of something long forgotten. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing faded wallpaper, broken furniture, and staircases that seemed to lead nowhere. The house groaned under their weight, as if waking from a long slumber. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence was suffocating, the kind that presses against your chest and makes your heart beat faster. Then Sarah broke it with a laugh. "You guys scared yet?" "Shut up," Lucas muttered, his voice shaky. They split up, each group exploring different parts of the house. Jacob, Emma, and Ben headed upstairs, while Lucas, Maya, Kelly, and Sarah ventured deeper into the lower rooms. The house seemed to stretch on forever, with hallways that twisted in impossible ways, doors that appeared where they hadn't been before. As the night wore on, tension grew. Small things started to happen, objects moving out of the corners of their eyes, whispers they couldn't quite make out, footsteps when no one was walking. The group dynamic began to fracture, paranoia seeping in like the cold air that now filled the house. It was Maya who found the first sign that something was wrong, truly, terrifyingly wrong. A notebook, tucked away behind a crumbling fireplace in what had once been a grand sitting room. Its pages were brittle, yellowed with age, but the handwriting was recent, frantic. It spoke of traps, of hidden mechanisms within the walls, doors that led to nowhere, and rooms that would twist and turn until you were lost forever. And, worst of all, it spoke of them, the others that roamed the house. They weren't ghosts, not in the traditional sense. They were something else, something that could think, plan, and, most disturbingly, lure. Maya's hands shook as she read the final entry. It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. Come find us. We've been waiting. Suddenly, the house felt alive, breathing around them, waiting for its next victim. Part 2, Trapped in the Dark. Maya stared at the notebook in her trembling hands, the weight of its words pressing down on her like a boulder. She flipped through the pages again, hoping she had missed something, an explanation, a way out. But the words remained the same, come find us. We've been waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest, loud and uneven, like it was trying to escape. Maya? Kelly's voice was barely a whisper, but it was sharp enough to slice through the silence. What did you find? Maya snapped the notebook shut, her pulse still racing. It's nothing. Just some old junk. She forced a laugh, though it felt unnatural, her voice cracking as she tucked the notebook behind her back. Kelly raised an eyebrow, sensing Maya's unease. What do you mean, nothing? You've been staring at that thing for like 5 minutes. Before Maya could respond, a loud bang echoed through the house, making everyone jump. The noise seemed to come from somewhere deeper within the house, reverberating through the old wooden beams. A strange, metallic scraping followed, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. What the hell was that? Sarah asked, her usual cocky demeanor cracking just a little. Lucas shone his flashlight down the hallway, but the beam barely penetrated the shadows. We should go find the others, he suggested, his voice unsteady. Maya nodded, still gripping the notebook tightly. The house was getting colder, and the shadows seemed to be moving in ways they shouldn't. Something wasn't right. Something was waiting. As they turned to leave the room, the door they had come through slammed shut with a deafening thud. Kelly screamed, grabbing onto Maya's arm. Lucas rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. What the fuck, he shouted, slamming his fists against the door. It won't open. Let me try, Maya said, pushing past him. She yanked at the handle, putting her full weight into it, but it didn't even rattle. It was as if the door had fused with the frame. From behind them, Sarah chuckled nervously. Okay, someone's messing with us. Right? Like, Jacob's trying to freak us out or something. Lucas shook his head, his face pale. Jacob's upstairs. He couldn't have locked this door from outside. A silence fell over the group as the realization sank in, they weren't alone. The house was watching them, playing with them. Suddenly, Kelly gasped, her flashlight flickering wildly. She pointed it toward the far corner of the room, where something had moved, just a blur in the dark, but enough to set every nerve on edge. Did you see that? Kelly's voice was high-pitched, verging on hysteria. There's something in here with us. Maya's flashlight flickered too, the light dimming until it went out completely, leaving them in near total darkness. The only light now came from the pale moonlight seeping through the cracked windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. Stay together, Maya whispered, her own fear thick in her throat. She could feel the notebook in her hands, the words still burning in her mind. We've been waiting. Something scraped along the walls, and the sound of a soft breath, too close, far too close, filled the room. Suddenly, the walls themselves seemed to shift, groaning as if alive, the floor creaking ominously beneath their feet. Kelly backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. We need to get out of here, she whispered frantically. We need to get out now. Lucas nodded, his face ashen, but he couldn't stop staring at the door. It hadn't just locked, it had vanished. Where the door once was, there was now nothing but smooth, uninterrupted wall. This is impossible, he muttered, stepping back. The door, it's gone. Sarah, pale but determined, took a few shaky steps forward. It's a trick, she said, more to herself than anyone else. It's just some kind of sick trick. But deep down, none of them believed it. The house was changing, shifting its very shape to trap them. And it was only just beginning. Meanwhile, upstairs, Jacob, Emma, and Ben were exploring what they thought was an old study. The room was lined with dusty shelves, filled with rotting books and strange trinkets. A large desk sat in the center, covered in cobwebs. It felt wrong in there, like the air was too thick, pressing down on them from all sides. "I don't like this," Emma muttered, glancing nervously at the door. "We should go find the others." Jacob, always trying to appear fearless, scoffed. "They're fine. Probably found some old attic to poke around in." Ben, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, nodded toward the far end of the room. "Do you hear that?" Emma strained her ears, but all she could hear was the wind rattling the broken windows. "I don't hear anything." Jacob frowned. "No, I hear it too. It's like," he paused, his face going pale. "Like someone, crying." The sound was faint at first, barely audible beneath the creaking of the house. But as they stood there in the dim light, it grew louder, a soft, pitiful sobbing, coming from somewhere beyond the walls. "Jacob," Emma said, her voice shaking, "we need to leave. Now." Before Jacob could respond, the door behind them slammed shut, and the crying stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. Then, in the corner of the room, something moved, a shadow, darker than the others, shifting and stretching toward them. Ben's flashlight flickered, then died. The darkness swallowed them whole. Part 3, The House Awakens. The air was thick and suffocating in the pitch-black room. Maya's breaths came in shallow gasps as her mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around them. The house was alive, twisting, changing, trapping them inside with no clear way out. "We need to stay calm," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "We'll find a way out." Kelly clutched Maya's arm, her knuckles white, her body trembling. The door is gone, Maya. What do we do? We can't stay here." Maya didn't answer. She didn't have one. But before she could even think, the walls groaned again, the sound deep and unsettling, like the house was taking a breath, waking from a long, dark sleep. The air around them grew colder, so cold that their breath formed pale clouds in the flickering beams of their flashlights. Lucas stood by the window, trying to see out, but the thick layer of grime and frost made it impossible. "We could break a window," he suggested, though he sounded unsure. He knew deep down the house wouldn't let them leave that easily. Sarah, always the most daring, was the only one who hadn't panicked yet. "It's fucking with us," she muttered. "The house, whatever it is, it's playing games." She stepped closer to the center of the room, her flashlight casting harsh shadows against the cracked walls. "But I'm not playing." With a sudden, reckless movement, Sarah slammed her foot into a nearby chair, knocking it across the room. The loud crack it made as it hit the floor echoed ominously, the sound stretching too long, too deep, like it was being swallowed by the house itself. "Great, Sarah," Maya snapped. "And what exactly did that do? Piss off the house even more?" Before Sarah could reply, the temperature dropped again, and with it came a low, deep sound, something between a growl and a groan, like the earth itself shifting. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, rattling the floor beneath their feet. "We need to move," Lucas said, his voice barely a whisper. "We can't just stand here." Maya turned back toward where the door had once been, only to find it replaced by another hallway, a narrow, twisted passageway that hadn't been there moments before. It stretched deep into the darkness, its walls almost pressing together, as though daring them to follow. "Did anyone else see that happen?" Kelly whispered. She pointed at the passage, eyes wide with terror. "The hallway, it wasn't there a second ago." It's moving, Maya said, a knot forming in her stomach. The house is moving. Sarah's eyes narrowed. So what? We go deeper in? Lucas looked like he was about to argue, but then the scraping sound started again, louder this time, as though something large was dragging itself closer. The noise sent a cold shiver down Maya's spine. We don't have a choice, Lucas said grimly. We can't stay here. They moved quickly, fear pushing them into the narrow hallway. The air was thick and foul, like rotting wood and decay. Every step they took echoed eerily, and the walls felt like they were closing in. As they pushed deeper, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the house was leading them somewhere, pulling them into its depths. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing to the point where they had to walk single file. The further they went, the more the house seemed to breathe, its groans and creaks almost rhythmic now, as if keeping time with their footsteps. I don't like this, Kelly whispered, her voice trembling. We're going the wrong way. We're getting deeper into this place. We should be going up, toward the windows, toward the roof. Maya's hand tightened around the flashlight, her eyes scanning the walls for any sign of another way out, but the walls were smooth, featureless. There were no doors, no windows. Just the suffocating blackness pressing in around them. I don't think the house is giving us a choice, Maya said softly. Suddenly, a sound cut through the tension, a loud crash, followed by a scream. The group froze. That was Emma, Lucas said, his eyes wide. It came from upstairs. Without thinking, they sprinted toward the noise, the twisted passage bending in impossible directions as they ran. Maya's heart raced as they reached a dead end, a solid wall where the passage should have continued. Fuck! Sarah shouted, slamming her fist against the wall. It's like the house is toying with us. As if in response, the wall behind them shifted, revealing a door. It creaked open on its own, leading to a spiraling staircase that climbed into the dark. Emma's scream echoed again, this time louder, closer. She's up there, Kelly said, her voice tight with fear. We have to go. Maya hesitated for just a moment. The stairs didn't look right. They twisted at odd angles, the steps uneven and jagged. But they had no other choice. She gave a sharp nod, and the group began their ascent. Upstairs, Jacob, Emma, and Ben had been exploring the strange study when everything had started to go wrong. The room had been silent for only a moment after Ben's flashlight died, but in that brief second of darkness, something had changed. When Jacob flicked his light back on, Emma was gone. She was right here, he whispered, scanning the room with wild eyes. She was standing right here. Ben took a cautious step forward, his voice low and shaky. Maybe she went out into the hallway? Jacob shook his head. No. I didn't hear her leave. She wouldn't. Before he could finish his sentence, the door to the study slammed shut, trapping them inside. The temperature plummeted, and a strange pressure filled the room, pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. Jacob's flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows against the walls. Then the whispering started. It was soft at first, barely audible, a faint, sibilant sound, like air escaping a cracked window. But it grew louder, the voices overlapping, each one tangled with the next until it became impossible to understand any of them. The whispers seemed to come from all around them, like the house itself was speaking, taunting them. Jacob's skin crawled as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. He spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but there was nothing, just the walls, pulsing and shifting in the dim light. Jacob, Ben's voice was barely a whisper. Jacob turned, and his stomach dropped. The wall behind Ben was moving. A ripple passed through the plaster, like something pressing against it from the other side. The shape grew more defined, more human, until it looked like a body, trapped, struggling to push through. Then the wall cracked open, and a hand reached out. Ben screamed, stumbling backward, but the hand grabbed him, pulling him toward the wall. He clawed at the floor, his eyes wide with terror as the whispers grew deafening. "Help me," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Jacob rushed forward, grabbing Ben's arm, but the pull from the wall was too strong. The hand tightened its grip, dragging Ben further into the wall until his body began to sink into the plaster, piece by piece. I can't hold on." Ben's voice was barely audible over the whispers now, his body halfway inside the wall. With a final, desperate cry, he disappeared, the wall sealing itself shut with a sickening crack. Jacob was alone. The room was silent once again, save for the faint sound of breathing that wasn't his own. Part 4, The Breaking Point. Jacob stood frozen in the middle of the study, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The room was too quiet now. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive silence felt worse, like something was watching, waiting for him to make the next move. The wall where Ben had disappeared looked perfectly normal, no cracks, no signs of struggle. It was as if Ben had never been there at all. He was alone, truly alone, and the terror of that realization sent a cold shiver through his body. His flashlight flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. He couldn't stay here. Not after what he'd just seen. "Emma," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible in the heavy air. "Emma." There was no response, only the soft creaking of the house settling around him, as if it were mocking his fear. His hands trembled as he gripped his flashlight tighter, his knuckles white. He needed to get out. He needed to find the others. But the door that had slammed shut behind him only moments ago was now gone, just like the wall in the other room had vanished. In its place was another hallway, stretching into the darkness. Jacob stared at it, his mind racing. The house was changing, twisting itself into something unfamiliar, something hostile. It was alive. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stay put, but the gnawing sense of being watched, of something lurking just behind him, pushed him forward. He took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. Downstairs, Maya, Lucas, Kelly, and Sarah climbed the crooked staircase in near silence, each step creaking under their weight. The air grew colder the higher they went, the temperature dropping to an unnatural chill that made their breath fog in front of them. The staircase felt endless, winding in impossible directions, twisting at odd angles that made it hard to keep their balance. This wasn't here before," Lucas said, his voice trembling. "There's no way this house could have a staircase like this. It's too high." Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the house pressing in on them, watching them. Every step felt like it was taking them further from the real world, deeper into some kind of twisted nightmare. "We have to keep going," she said, though her voice lacked any real conviction. Sarah, who had been walking in front, suddenly stopped. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. "Wait, do you hear that?" They all froze, listening. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, from somewhere above them, came a soft, rhythmic thud. It was steady, like someone slowly tapping their hand against a wall, or walking. Kelly's grip tightened on Maya's arm. "Oh my God, it's coming from above us." Lucas swallowed hard, his face pale. "We need to go back." "We can't," Maya whispered, her throat dry. She gestured to the staircase behind them, where the way back had disappeared. The steps now ended abruptly, vanishing into a solid wall. "There's no way down anymore." Sarah's face twisted into a scowl. "This is bullshit. The house is screwing with us." Kelly's flashlight flickered again, and for a moment the shadows seemed to move, like something was shifting just out of sight. The tapping sound above them grew louder, more deliberate. Whatever it was coming closer. "We need to keep moving," Maya urged, her voice tight with fear. We don't know what's behind us, and we can't go back. We have to go forward. Reluctantly, the others agreed, and they pressed on, the tapping now echoing in their ears, louder with each step. The staircase twisted sharply, almost disorienting, until it finally opened into a narrow hallway lined with decaying doors. The smell of mildew and rot clung to the air, thick and overpowering. "This place doesn't make any sense," Lucas muttered, running his hand along the crumbling walls. "We've been walking for what feels like hours. How big can this house be?" Maya didn't have an answer. She didn't want to think about how wrong everything felt, the way the house seemed to stretch and shift, pulling them deeper into its clutches. Her fingers tightened around the notebook she had found earlier, the cryptic message echoing in her mind, "Come find us. We've been waiting." What had they found instead? What was waiting for them? The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence. It was worse than the noise, more ominous. Maya's pulse quickened as her flashlight passed over the doors, each one rotting and splintered. Then, from one of the doors near the end of the hallway, they heard it, a whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help, me." Kelly gasped, backing up against the wall. Who was that? Was that Emma? Maya's breath hitched in her throat. It was Emma's voice, but it was faint, weak. Something was very wrong. She glanced at the others, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to check it out." "No way," Lucas said, shaking his head. That didn't sound right. That wasn't her." "What if it was?" Kelly whispered. "We can't just leave her in there." Sarah marched toward the door, her flashlight bouncing in her hand. "I'm not waiting around for some monster to jump out at us. If Emma's in there, we're getting her out." The door creaked loudly as Sarah pushed it open. The room beyond was small and dark, barely illuminated by their flashlights. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of something metallic, blood, hung in the air. At the far end of the room, hunched in the corner, was a figure. It was Emma. Her head was lowered, her hair falling over her face, and her body was shaking, as if she were sobbing quietly. "Emma?" Kelly called out, taking a cautious step forward. "Emma, it's us, we're here to help." Emma didn't respond. Her body shook harder, her hands gripping the sides of her head. Her sobs grew louder, but they sounded off. Almost like an echo, a distortion. Maya stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Emma? What's wrong? We're here now. We can get you out." But as they drew closer, Emma's sobs turned to low, wet gasps, like she was choking. Maya's gut twisted with dread. Something wasn't right. She slowed her steps, her hand gripping Kelly's arm to stop her from getting too close. "Wait," Maya said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." Emma's body jerked, spasming violently, her head still lowered. And then, without warning, she laughed, a sick, gurgling laugh that echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls like nails on a chalkboard. The sound of it sent chills racing down Maya's spine. Kelly gasped and stumbled back, her eyes wide with horror. "That's not her." Suddenly, Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. But it wasn't Emma's face anymore. It was a mask of twisted flesh, her features stretched into something unnatural, something wrong. "We've been waiting for you," she whispered, her voice not her own. "Come find us." And then, in one horrifying moment, Emma's body collapsed in on itself, folding, twisting into the shadows of the room like smoke being sucked into a void. The walls around them trembled, and the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The last thing they heard before the lights went out was the sound of her laughter, echoing in the darkness. Part 5, Whispers in the Dark. Maya's breath caught in her throat as the room plunged into total darkness. Her flashlight flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving them in a thick, suffocating blackness. Emma's laughter still echoed in her ears, an unnatural sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Kelly was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling. What the hell just happened? Maya tried to answer, but her mouth was dry, her tongue heavy. She reached out blindly, her fingers brushing Kelly's arm, cold and clammy. I don't know. Her voice faltered as the weight of their situation pressed in on her, as suffocating as the darkness itself. We have to get out of here. Now. Sarah's voice cut through the dark, sharp and defiant. No shit, genius. But how do you suggest we do that? There was an edge of panic in her usual bravado. The door slammed shut. And I'm not touching whatever the fuck that was. Maya took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. There has to be a way out. We can't just die here. Sarah snorted, though the sound was strained. Oh, we can. Trust me, we can. From the corner of the room, Lucas's voice wavered. This can't be happening. This is some kind of trick. There's no way the house is alive. That wasn't Emma. It couldn't have been. Kelly whimpered softly, her body trembling against Maya. But it looked like her, and it sounded like her. Maya's mind raced as she fumbled in the darkness, her hand finally finding the cold, rough surface of the door. She ran her fingers along its frame, desperately seeking a handle, a latch, anything to pry it open. But it was smooth, sealed. As if the house had absorbed the door into its walls, like it had with the others. We're trapped, she whispered, her chest tightening with fear. Suddenly, there was a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, just behind her. Maya froze, her skin crawling as the voice grew louder, clearer, until it was right next to her ear. Maya. She gasped, spinning around, her hands shaking as she pointed her dead flashlight into the void. Who said that? The others remained silent, but in the darkness, Maya could feel them, could hear their breathing, fast and shallow. The voice had been real, she knew it. She wasn't imagining things. Something, or someone, was in the room with them. Maya? Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. Are you okay? Before she could respond, the whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to get her attention. Maya, come closer. It was Emma's voice again. But this time, it wasn't laughing. It was soft, pleading, like a child lost in the dark. Maya's blood ran cold. Stop it. Just stop. Kelly's breathing quickened. Maya, what's happening? Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse roaring in her ears. Something's talking to me. Talking to you? Sarah's voice was sharp, but Maya could hear the fear beneath it. Like what? Like the thing pretending to be Emma? Maya nodded, though she wasn't sure if anyone could see her. Yeah. But it's not her. It's like it's trying to sound like her. Lucas took a shaky breath. It's messing with us. The house, whatever it is, it's alive. And it's using our fear against us. The whisper came again, this time closer, too close. Please. Maya. Don't leave me here. Maya's hand tightened around Kelly's arm, her nails digging into her skin. It's not real. It can't be real. But deep down, she wasn't sure. The voice sounded so much like Emma, so much like her friend that it was hard to separate the truth from the nightmare. And the house, it was playing with their minds, twisting reality. Guys, Kelly's voice was barely a whisper now, quivering with fear. Something's wrong with the walls. Maya turned slowly, her dead flashlight useless as the darkness swallowed them. She reached out, her hand trembling as it met the cold, damp surface of the wall. It felt alive. The texture was wrong, slick and pulsing, like the skin of some great beast. It moved beneath her fingers, writhing and twisting as though it were breathing. "I feel it," Sarah said, her voice thin, almost lost in the darkness. "The walls, they're alive." Before they could react, the air shifted again, thickening with an unnatural energy. The room seemed to press in on them, the darkness growing heavier, as though the house itself was closing in. The walls groaned, bending inward, the space shrinking. Maya stumbled backward, her breath coming in panicked gasps. "We have to move," she yelled, grabbing Kelly's hand and pulling her toward the far end of the room, where another door, a rotting, splintered thing, stood half-hidden in the dark. Lucas and Sarah followed, their footsteps frantic as they rushed toward the door. But just as they reached it, the whisper came again, louder this time, filling the room like a sickening chorus. "Come find us." The door swung open on its own, revealing another hallway, twisting and narrow, leading into the unknown. Maya hesitated, her mind racing. The house was guiding them deeper into its twisted heart. It was leading them somewhere they weren't meant to go. But there was no choice. Staying in the room was a death sentence. They had to move forward, no matter what lay ahead. "Go," Maya said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. "We have to keep moving." One by one, they stepped through the doorway, the hallway closing in around them like a vice. The walls were closer now, pressing against their shoulders as they moved, the floor creaking beneath their feet. The air was thick, suffocating, and with every step they took, the whispers grew louder, more distorted, until they became an unintelligible roar. Suddenly, the hallway opened into a vast, cavernous space, the ceiling disappearing into the darkness above. The floor was uneven, cracked, and the smell of rot was overpowering, making them gag as they moved forward. In the center of the room stood a large, decrepit table, covered in dust and something darker, thicker. At first, it looked like a pile of rotting debris, but as they drew closer, Maya's flashlight flickered back to life, casting a weak glow over the scene. It wasn't debris. It was bones. Dozens of bones, piled haphazardly across the table, some still draped in ragged scraps of clothing. And on the wall behind them, written in a thick, dark substance, blood, Maya realized with a sickening lurch, were the words. "We are not alone." Kelly choked back a scream, her body trembling uncontrollably as she backed away from the table. What the fuck is this? Who are these people?" Maya's stomach turned as she stared at the bones, her mind reeling. "They're the missing people. The ones who disappeared in this house." The realization hit them all at once, the people who had vanished inside Whitmore House over the years, the ones the police had never found. They were here. They were trapped, Lucas whispered, his face pale as he stared at the bones. "Just like us." Sarah's jaw clenched, her hands curling into fists. "Not like us. We're not staying here. We're getting out." But as she spoke, the walls groaned again, and from the far side of the room came the soft, rhythmic tapping they had heard before. Something was coming. Something was in the house with them. "We need to move," Maya hissed, grabbing Kelly's arm and pulling her toward the opposite door. "Now!" They didn't wait. Without looking back, they sprinted across the room, their footsteps echoing in the vast, hollow space. The tapping grew louder, closer, the sound of footsteps joining it, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was following them was taking its time, savoring their fear. They reached the door and threw it open, but instead of another hallway, they were greeted by a massive, spiraling staircase that descended into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was colder, thicker, as if they were descending into a grave. "We have to go," Maya urged, pushing forward. "We don't have a choice." With one last glance behind them, at the bones, the blood, the shadows that moved in the dark, they began their descent. The steps creaked beneath their weight, and with every step they took, the whispers grew louder. "We've been waiting." Part 6, The Descent. The staircase spiraled endlessly, plunging them deeper into the belly of the house, each step creaking under their weight. The air grew colder with every turn, thicker, like they were descending into some ancient, forgotten crypt. The darkness below seemed to pull at them, dragging them deeper into the unknown. Maya's flashlight flickered weakly, barely cutting through the gloom. The whispers had followed them, growing louder, more insistent, the voices merging into a twisted chorus of overlapping pleas and threats. Kelly was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "How far down does this go?" Maya didn't answer. She had no idea. The staircase felt endless, twisting and turning in impossible directions. Her legs ached, her breathing shallow and ragged, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when something was following them. Behind her, Sarah's steps quickened. "We can't keep going down. This is taking us deeper into whatever this is. There has to be another way out." Lucas shook his head, his face pale and drawn in the dim light. "We don't have a choice. We're trapped. This is the only way the house is letting us go." Maya gritted her teeth, pushing back the rising panic. She didn't want to believe it, but Lucas was right. The house wasn't letting them leave. It was leading them, guiding them deeper into its heart. The truth was a bitter pill to swallow, but there was no denying it now. They weren't in control anymore. The house was. "We'll figure it out," Maya whispered, more to herself than the others. "We just have to keep moving." But even as she said the words, her heart sank. How could they figure it out? The house was twisting reality around them, bending the laws of nature, trapping them in an ever-shifting maze of nightmares. Every door led them somewhere new, every hallway changed behind them, and the whispers, the voices, were getting louder, more urgent, as if the house was growing impatient. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere far below, reverberating up through the staircase like a distant thunderclap. They all froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What the hell was that?" Kelly whispered, her grip tightening on Maya's arm. Before anyone could respond, the sound came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't just a bang. It was the sound of something massive moving, shifting in the darkness below. "We need to move," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "Now." Maya didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Kelly's hand, and they rushed down the staircase, their footsteps loud and frantic in the suffocating silence. The air grew colder as they descended, thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. The walls around them seemed to close in, pressing against their shoulders, narrowing the staircase as if the house was squeezing them into its grip. The sound of something heavy dragging itself through the darkness continued to grow louder. Whatever it was coming. As they reached the bottom of the staircase, Maya's flashlight flickered again, casting weak, erratic shadows across the floor. They found themselves in a massive chamber, the ceiling lost to the shadows above. The walls were made of stone, cold and wet, like the inside of a tomb. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, covered in strange symbols carved deep into the surface. The air around it was thick with an unnatural energy, almost humming with malevolence. "What is this place?" Lucas asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It looks like a ritual chamber. Some kind of, I don't know, sacrifice room." Maya's stomach churned as she stepped closer to the altar, her flashlight flickering across the strange symbols. They were ancient, unreadable, but they radiated a sense of dread that made her skin crawl. The air here felt alive, pulsing with dark energy, as if the room itself was waiting for something. Kelly stepped back, her face pale. "We shouldn't be here. We need to leave." But before anyone could respond, the sound came again, the dragging, heavy noise from deep within the shadows. It was louder now, impossibly close, as if something was lurking just beyond the edges of their flashlight beams. Lucas pointed toward the far end of the chamber, his hand shaking. "There's something there. Do you see it?" They all turned, their flashlights sweeping across the dark, and for a moment, Maya's heart stopped. There, in the shadows, was a shape, tall, hunched, and twisted. It was barely visible, a dark mass of limbs and sinew, moving with slow, deliberate steps. Its body scraped against the stone walls, leaving deep gouges in the ancient stone as it dragged itself closer. Kelly let out a small whimper, backing away. Oh my God, it's coming." Maya's mind raced, her body frozen in terror. The creature was massive, its form shifting in the shadows, as if it were made of darkness itself. Its movements were slow but purposeful, and the air around it seemed to bend and warp as it approached. "We have to move," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking through the haze of fear. But there was nowhere to go. The staircase had vanished behind them, leaving only solid stone. The chamber had closed in around them, trapping them with the thing that was coming closer, its massive body blocking any hope of escape. Lucas stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "What is that? What the hell is that?" Maya's flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, the creature was fully illuminated. It was hideous, its skin stretched tight over a twisted frame of bone and muscle, its face a grotesque mask of jagged teeth and hollow, black eyes. It moved with a sickening grace, dragging its long, spindly limbs across the floor as it closed in on them. Kelly screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. "It's going to kill us." Maya's heart pounded in her chest as the creature drew closer, its hulking form filling the chamber with a presence that felt ancient, wrong. She grabbed Kelly's hand, pulling her away from the altar, but it was no use. The creature was too close now, its body towering over them, its breath a low, wet rasp that sent shivers down Maya's spine. Just as the creature lunged toward them, something strange happened. The room shifted. The walls rippled, the stone bending and warping like liquid, and suddenly the chamber was no longer the cold, dark tomb they had been trapped in. It was a hallway. The altar, the creature, the ritual chamber, all of it was gone, replaced by the familiar, decaying interior of Whitmore House. They were standing in a narrow corridor, the wallpaper peeling and the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of rot was overpowering. It was as if the house had pulled them back from the brink, only to drop them into another part of its endless, shifting maze. "What just happened?" Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. Maya shook her head, her hands still trembling. "I don't know." Sarah was the first to move, her face pale but determined. "It's fucking with us. The house, it's controlling everything. It's playing games." Kelly collapsed against the wall, her body trembling. I can't do this anymore. I can't." Maya knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get out of here. We just need to stay calm." But even as she said the words, she didn't believe them. The house had shown them its true nature, its hunger, and now it was toying with them, bending reality to its will. Sarah shone her flashlight down the hallway, her jaw clenched. "We keep moving. We don't stop. Not until we're out." They nodded in grim agreement and began to walk, their footsteps slow and deliberate. The hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Doors lined the walls, each one closed, their handles rusted and worn. But none of them dared to open one. Not after what they had seen. The whispers had returned, faint at first but growing louder with every step they took. They echoed off the walls, overlapping in a maddening chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. "We've been waiting. Part 7, The Lost Ones. The hallway stretched on like an endless maze, the flickering beams of their flashlights barely cutting through the oppressive gloom. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more insistent with every step, twisting around the corners and through the walls. The words, overlapping in an eerie chorus, were starting to make sense now, a rhythm repeating in their minds like a cursed song. We've been waiting. We've been waiting. Kelly stumbled over a broken floorboard, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I can't keep going, she whispered, her voice trembling. I can't. This place, it's driving me crazy. Maya grabbed her arm, steadying her. You have to. We all do. There's no other choice. But she could feel it too, the suffocating grip of the house tightening around them, pressing in from all sides, as if it were trying to squeeze the life out of them. Sarah, leading the group with her jaw set in grim determination, kept walking, though her steps were heavier now, slower. She hadn't spoken much since they escaped the creature in the ritual chamber. She was focused, her eyes darting from door to door, as if looking for something, anything, that might help them escape. Lucas lagged behind, his face pale, his body slouched as though the weight of the house was dragging him down. How do we know we're not just going in circles, he muttered. Everything looks the same. We don't, Maya replied, keeping her voice steady despite the panic gnawing at the edges of her mind. But we have to keep moving. The house, it changes, it's trying to confuse us, trap us. If we stop, we'll. Her words were cut off by a loud bang from behind them, like a door being slammed shut with impossible force. Kelly screamed, clapping her hands over her ears as the sound echoed through the hallway, bouncing off the walls. What was that? Lucas asked, his voice barely more than a breath. They all turned, their flashlights sweeping through the darkness, but the hallway behind them was empty, no doors, no movement. Just the endless, suffocating black. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. Keep going. Don't stop. But even as they pressed forward, the air seemed to thicken around them, heavy with the stench of rot. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the walls, once peeling and covered in dust, seemed to shift, becoming damp, pulsing with a sickening, organic texture. It felt like they were walking through the veins of a giant, living creature. Kelly whimpered, her voice barely audible. This place, it's alive. It's alive. Sarah spun around, her flashlight beam bouncing off the walls, catching strange, moving shapes in the shadows. Don't lose it, Kelly. We're going to get out of here. We just need to. She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes locking onto something at the far end of the hallway. Wait, do you see that? Maya squinted into the distance, her flashlight barely cutting through the dark. At first, it looked like just another shadow, but then she saw it, movement. A figure, standing at the very edge of their vision, silhouetted against the gloom. Who's that? Lucas whispered, stepping back. Maya's heart skipped a beat. Could it be Emma? Was it possible that she had survived, that they hadn't lost her to whatever monstrous thing had taken her place? But as the figure stepped forward, the dim light revealing more of its form, her hope turned to icy dread. It wasn't Emma. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, its arms hanging limply by its sides, the skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its face was obscured by shadows, but there was something wrong about the way it moved, jerky, unnatural, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. Kelly stumbled back, her voice breaking. It's coming, it's coming. The figure took another step, and Maya caught a glimpse of its face, a hollow, sunken mask of gray skin, its eyes wide and empty, like dark holes in a withered skull. It didn't have a mouth. Just a gaping void where one should have been. Oh my God, Lucas whispered. What is that? The figure took another step, then another, its jerky movements speeding up, becoming more erratic, more frantic. The sound of its footsteps was wrong, too heavy, too loud for something so skeletal. It was as though the house was amplifying the noise, making each step echo louder, closer. Maya turned on her heel, grabbing Kelly and pulling her forward. Run! Run! The group sprinted down the hallway, their footsteps pounding against the uneven floorboards, the air growing colder as they raced away from the figure. But no matter how fast they ran, the sound of its footsteps followed, growing louder, closer, as if the thing was right behind them, breathing down their necks. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, her face pale. It's gaining on us. Maya's lungs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, her heart hammering in her chest. The hallway twisted and turned, but there was no sign of an exit, no windows, no doors, just the endless corridor stretching ahead of them like a never-ending tunnel of darkness. The whispers grew louder, more urgent now, and the words became clear, seeping into their minds like poison. You can't escape. We've been waiting. You can't escape. Kelly stumbled, nearly falling, but Maya grabbed her, pulling her back to her feet. Keep going. But just as they rounded a corner, the hallway opened into a wide, circular room. Maya skidded to a halt, her heart sinking as she realized where they were. It was the same room they had started in. The same rotting floorboards, the same peeling wallpaper. And in the center of the room stood the same stone altar, the pile of bones resting atop it, the dark symbols carved into the walls. No, Lucas breathed, his voice trembling. No, no, no. We've been here before. Sarah cursed, slamming her fist against the wall. It's the house. It's fucking with us. Kelly collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. We're going to die here. We're going to die. Maya knelt beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. We're not going to die. We're getting out of here. But even as she said the words, she felt the weight of the house pressing down on her, crushing her hope. The figure was still coming, its footsteps echoing through the hall, closer now, relentless. Sarah's flashlight beam darted across the room, scanning the walls for any sign of an exit. There has to be another way out. There has to be. But there wasn't. The room was sealed, just like before. No doors. No windows. Just the altar, the bones, and the dark symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The footsteps stopped. Maya froze, her heart racing. She turned slowly, her flashlight flickering in the darkness. The figure stood in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on them, its skeletal body swaying gently from side to side. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched. Kelly whimpered, clinging to Maya's arm. It's going to kill us. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, swaying, its dark eyes unblinking. What does it want? Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. Maya's gaze shifted to the altar, to the pile of bones resting on top of it. The dark symbols carved into the stone seemed to glow faintly now, pulsing with a sickly light. The air around the altar was thick with an unnatural energy, a sense of something ancient, something that had been waiting for them all along. I think it wants us to finish what was started, Maya whispered, her voice trembling. This house, it's been taking people for years. All those people who disappeared, they're here, somewhere. And now it's our turn. Sarah's jaw clenched. Fuck that. We're not doing anything this thing wants. But before anyone could respond, the whispers grew louder, filling the room, drowning out their thoughts. The figure in the doorway took a slow, deliberate step forward, its hollow eyes fixed on the altar. Finish it. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the pile of bones, the dark symbols glowing brighter now. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, its will bearing down on them like a suffocating force. The house wasn't just a house, it was something else, something ancient and hungry, and it wanted them to finish what had been started so many years ago. What do we do? Lucas whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Maya didn't have an answer. All she knew was that they were running out of time. The house was closing in around them, and the figure was getting closer. If they didn't act soon, they'd be trapped forever, just like the others. We don't have a choice, Maya whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. We have to finish it. Part 8, Sacrifice. Maya's mind raced as the figure loomed in the doorway, swaying gently, its dark, hollow eyes fixed on the altar. The whispers were almost deafening now, echoing through the room like a chant, urging them forward, pulling them deeper into the nightmare. She could feel the house's will pressing down on her, relentless, insistent. It wanted them to finish the ritual, to complete whatever dark sacrifice had been left unfinished. But what did that mean? And what would happen if they didn't? We can't just do what it wants, Sarah hissed, her flashlight trembling in her hand. There has to be another way. Maya's eyes darted around the room, desperate for an escape, but the walls seemed to be closing in, the dark symbols on the altar glowing brighter, pulsing with a sick, malevolent energy. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, and she could feel the weight of the house in every breath she took. Kelly sobbed softly, still huddled on the floor, her body trembling with fear. We're going to die here. Just like the others. Lucas knelt beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. We're not dead yet, he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes were locked on the figure in the doorway, his face pale. But we need to do something. We can't just sit here. Maya's thoughts spun wildly. There was something they were missing, something the house was trying to show them, something it wanted them to see. Her gaze shifted to the altar, to the bones piled haphazardly on top of it. They weren't just any bones. They were human. The remains of the others who had vanished in the house, their bodies twisted, broken, left behind as some kind of offering. And now it was their turn. The house has been taking people for years, Maya whispered, her voice trembling. But it's never been satisfied. It's been waiting for us, to finish it. To finish the sacrifice. Lucas swallowed hard, his eyes wide. Sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice? Maya shook her head. I don't know. But I think that's what the house wants. It's what all of this has been leading up to. The ritual, the symbols, the bones, it all points to one thing. Sarah's jaw clenched, her face pale in the dim light. I'm not sacrificing anyone. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with their maddening chorus. The figure in the doorway took another step forward, its skeletal limbs moving jerkily, its hollow eyes fixed on the altar. It was waiting. Watching. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. The house wasn't going to let them leave. Not unless they did what it wanted. She could feel it in the very air, the oppressive weight of its will pressing down on them, demanding obedience. We have to do something, Lucas urged, his voice tight with fear. It's not going to let us go until we finish, whatever this is. Maya looked at the altar again, the bones gleaming in the dim light, the dark symbols pulsing with energy. And then she noticed something, a small, curved knife resting on the edge of the stone, half covered in dust. The blade was old, rusted, but it was sharp enough to serve its purpose. A chill ran down her spine as she stepped closer to the altar, her hand trembling as she reached for the knife. The whispers grew louder, almost excited, as if the house itself was urging her on, pushing her toward the inevitable. Maya, no, Sarah snapped, grabbing her arm. We are not sacrificing anyone. There's another way out of this. There has to be. Maya shook her head, her eyes locked on the knife. I don't think there is. The house, it's been waiting for this. We don't have a choice. Kelly's sobs grew louder, her body shaking uncontrollably. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. Lucas's face was pale, his eyes darting between Maya and the figure in the doorway. What if the sacrifice doesn't mean killing someone? What if it means something else? Sarah scoffed, though there was fear in her eyes. What the hell are you talking about? Lucas's voice wavered. Look, I don't know, but all those people, the ones who disappeared, they didn't kill each other. They just vanished. Maybe the house is trying to trap us here, make us part of it. Maybe that's the real sacrifice. Maya hesitated, the knife still heavy in her hand. Could Lucas be right? Was the house trying to consume them, to add them to its twisted collection of souls? The thought made her skin crawl, but it also gave her hope. Maybe there was a way out, without spilling blood. But before she could speak, the figure took another step forward, its skeletal hand outstretched toward the altar. The air around it seemed to vibrate with dark energy, and Maya felt a sudden pressure in her chest, as if the house was tightening its grip on her. We've been waiting. Maya's heart raced as the figure moved closer, its empty eyes fixed on her, its bony fingers reaching for the knife. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with a sickening sense of dread. We have to finish it, Maya whispered, her voice trembling. Or we'll be trapped here forever. But Sarah wasn't listening. She shoved Maya back, grabbing the knife from her hand and tossing it across the room. We're not doing this. I'm not letting you kill anyone. The knife clattered against the floor, sliding into the shadows. For a moment, everything went still. The whispers stopped, the air grew heavy with anticipation, and the figure in the doorway froze, its hand hovering just above the altar. Then, with a sudden, deafening crack, the walls of the room began to collapse inward, the floorboards splintering beneath their feet, the ceiling groaning as if the entire house was being torn apart from the inside. The dark symbols on the walls flared to life, glowing with an intense, blinding light. Kelly screamed, scrambling to her feet as the floor buckled beneath her. It's falling apart. The house is collapsing. Maya's eyes darted around the room, her mind racing. The house wasn't just collapsing, it was reacting. Sarah's defiance had triggered something the house hadn't expected. The figure in the doorway let out a low, guttural moan, its body convulsing violently as the light from the symbols enveloped it. The air around it shimmered, bending and warping as the house's will fought to regain control. We have to move. Lucas shouted, grabbing Kelly's hand and pulling her toward the far side of the room. Get to the door. But as they ran, the walls continued to cave in, the floor crumbling beneath them. The air was thick with dust and debris, and the oppressive energy from the symbols seemed to pulse through their bodies, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Maya stumbled toward the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure in the doorway was still convulsing, its body flickering in and out of existence as the house tore itself apart. The whispers had returned, but now they were frantic, desperate. Finish it. Finish it. Finish it. Suddenly, Sarah let out a sharp cry, collapsing to the ground. Maya rushed to her side, grabbing her arm and pulling her up. We have to go. But Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. The knife, we need the knife. Maya hesitated. The knife was gone, lost in the shadows, but Sarah's words echoed in her mind. The house wanted the ritual to be completed, wanted the sacrifice. And if they didn't finish it, the house would tear them apart, just like it had done to the others. But it wasn't supposed to be this way. Maya's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. The house wasn't in control anymore. Sarah's defiance had changed everything. The ritual was broken. The house's plan was falling apart, and now it was desperate. We don't need the knife, Maya said, pulling Sarah to her feet. We just need to get out of here. Lucas and Kelly had already reached the far side of the room, where a new door had appeared, glowing faintly in the flickering light. Maya and Sarah rushed to join them, their hearts pounding as the floor buckled and cracked beneath their feet. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices overlapping, screaming, pleading. "Don't leave. Don't leave." They reached the door just as the ceiling began to collapse, chunks of wood and stone crashing down around them. Maya pushed Kelly through the doorway, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the air grew thicker, heavier. The figure in the doorway let out one final, agonized wail before it disappeared, swallowed by the collapsing room. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the house stilled. Maya blinked, her vision swimming as the room returned to silence. The whispers were gone. The house had stopped moving. They were standing in a long, narrow hallway, the walls covered in thick, black mold, the air damp and cold. The door behind them had vanished, leaving them trapped once again. What just happened?" Kelly whispered, her voice shaking. Maya swallowed hard, her heart still racing. "I don't know. But I think we broke it." Lucas stared at her, his face pale. "What do you mean, we broke it?" Maya shook her head, her mind spinning. "The ritual. It wasn't supposed to go like this. The house, it wasn't ready for what we did. We didn't play by its rules." Sarah's jaw clenched, her hands trembling. "So what now? Is it over?" Maya didn't answer. She didn't know. The house had stopped, but they were still trapped. Still lost. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, she could feel it, the house was waiting. It wasn't over yet. Part 9, A Deadly Calm. The hallway they found themselves in was silent, too silent. It was as if the house had taken a deep breath and held it, waiting, biding its time. The air felt thick and stale, damp with decay, as if the walls themselves were rotting from the inside out. The black mold that crept up the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were alive, feeding off the fear that saturated the room. Maya's head throbbed with exhaustion, her body aching from the strain of the night. The whispers had stopped, but their echo still lingered in her mind, like a distant ringing she couldn't shake. It felt wrong, the absence of noise, the stillness. Like the calm before the storm. Kelly hugged herself tightly, her face streaked with tears. She hadn't stopped trembling since they had passed through the last door. "What if it's not over?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not," Maya replied, her voice flat. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing dread that wouldn't let go. The house hadn't finished with them yet. It was merely waiting. For what, she didn't know. Sarah leaned against the moldy wall, her eyes bloodshot, her face pale. "It doesn't make any sense. Why would the house stop now? After everything it's done?" She wiped a streak of sweat from her forehead, her expression hardening. "I don't trust this silence." Lucas was pacing, his hands shoved into his pockets. He had been jittery since the collapse of the ritual chamber, his eyes darting between the others and the walls. "Maybe we broke it," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe that thing back there, whatever it was the key. And now that it's gone, the house doesn't have control anymore." Maya shook her head. "No. We didn't finish it. Whatever the house wanted from us, we didn't give it." She glanced around the hallway, her gut twisting. "We're not out yet." The others fell silent, their faces reflecting the same fear that Maya felt crawling under her skin. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Even with the figure gone, the house felt alive, like it was listening, waiting for them to slip up. "We need to keep moving," Sarah said finally, pushing herself away from the wall. "We can't stay here, waiting for it to come back. We have to find a way out." Kelly's voice was small. "But what if there isn't one?" "There is," Maya insisted, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. "We just have to keep looking." Sarah started down the hallway first, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The others followed, their footsteps slow and cautious. The floorboards creaked beneath their weight, the sound unnerving in the otherwise oppressive silence. The hallway twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the house. At times, the passage narrowed to the point where they had to walk. Single file, the walls pressing in on them like a suffocating embrace. The air grew colder, and the dampness in the air thickened, filling their lungs with the smell of mildew and something foul, something that made their stomachs churn. "This place is like a maze," Lucas muttered, his eyes scanning the walls. "I don't understand how it's possible. It shouldn't be this big." "It's not," Sarah snapped. "The house is playing tricks on us. It's not real." Maya wasn't so sure. Everything felt too real, the cold air, the creaking floorboards, the decay seeping through the walls. This house wasn't just an illusion. It was alive, and it was hungry. They passed several closed doors along the hallway, each one warped and splintered with age. Maya hesitated as they approached another one. The door was slightly ajar, a faint glow of light seeping through the crack. Something about it made her stomach clench with dread, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that it could lead them out of this nightmare. "Should we?" Lucas started, gesturing to the door. Maya nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to keep walking. "We have to try. There might be a way out." Kelly shook her head, backing away from the door. "No. I can't. I can't go through another one of those doors." Sarah stepped forward, her jaw clenched. "I'll check it." Without waiting for anyone else, she grabbed the edge of the door and pushed it open, her flashlight slicing through the gloom. The room beyond was bathed in a soft, flickering light. It was small, almost claustrophobic, the walls lined with cracked mirrors that distorted their reflections into grotesque shapes. A single chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting faint shadows that danced eerily across the floor. And in the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was a small figure. A child. Maya's breath caught in her throat, her pulse racing. The child stood with its back to them, its head bowed, its tiny hands clasped in front of it as though in prayer. The hair was long and matted, dirty and unkempt, hanging over the child's shoulders like a veil. Who is that?" Kelly whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas took a cautious step forward, his flashlight flickering across the child's small frame. "It's just a kid," he muttered. Maybe it's one of the people who went missing. Maybe they're trapped here like we are." But Maya felt a deep, gnawing sense of unease. There was something wrong about the way the child stood, too still, too quiet. The air around it felt different, heavier, like the very atmosphere was warped by its presence. "Don't get too close," Maya warned, her voice tight with fear. Sarah took another step forward, ignoring Maya's warning. "Hey," she called out softly, her hand outstretched. "Are you okay? We can help you." The child didn't move. It stood there, motionless, its head still bowed. Sarah took another step closer. "We're not going to hurt you. We just want to." Before she could finish, the child's head snapped up, its body twisting unnaturally fast. The movement was so sudden, so violent, that Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The child's face was a mask of horror. Its eyes were wide, hollow, and dark, too dark. Like empty pits that stared straight through them. The skin was pale, stretched too tightly over its skull, the lips drawn back into a grotesque grin that seemed frozen in place. And then it screamed. The sound was unlike anything Maya had ever heard. It wasn't just a scream of terror or pain. It was inhuman, a sound that ripped through the air like claws on metal, vibrating through their bones, filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. Kelly collapsed to the floor, covering her ears as the scream filled her head. "Make it stop. Make it stop." Lucas stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "What the fuck is that?" Maya's body trembled as she struggled to move, to think, but the scream seemed to freeze her in place. The child's eyes were locked on hers now, black and endless, like staring into the void. She felt something tugging at her mind, something pulling her toward the child. "No," Maya gasped, forcing herself to look away. "Don't look at it. Don't look at its eyes." But it was too late. Sarah's body jerked violently as she stumbled forward, her face twisted in pain. Her hands clutched at her head, her eyes wide with terror. I can't." Before she could finish, her body collapsed to the floor, convulsing violently as the scream filled the room, louder and louder, until it was the only thing any of them could hear. Maya dropped to her knees, clutching her head as the sound threatened to tear her mind apart. The child's eyes bore into her, cold and empty, pulling her deeper into the void. She had to fight it. She had to stop it. "Get out of the room!" Maya screamed, her voice barely audible over the shrieking. "Get out!" Lucas grabbed Kelly, pulling her to her feet as they stumbled toward the door. Maya forced herself to stand, her legs shaking beneath her as she rushed toward Sarah, who was still convulsing on the floor, her eyes rolling back into her head. The scream seemed to grow louder, more desperate, as though the house itself was feeding off their fear. Maya grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the door with every ounce of strength she had left. "Come on. We have to go." But Sarah's body was limp, her face pale and lifeless. The child's eyes never left them, its grin stretching impossibly wide as the scream echoed through the room. Maya's vision blurred, her mind swimming as the sound drilled into her skull. She stumbled through the door, dragging Sarah's body behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. The second they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut, and the scream stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Kelly collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. What the hell was that? What was that thing? Maya's hands shook as she knelt beside Sarah, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "But we have to keep moving." Lucas leaned against the wall, his face pale. She's not dead, is she?" Maya pressed her fingers to Sarah's neck, searching for a pulse. For a moment, there was nothing. But then, faintly, she felt it, a slow, weak heartbeat. "She's alive," Maya said, relief flooding her chest. "But barely. We need to get out of this house." Kelly wiped her eyes, her body still trembling. "How? How do we get out?" Maya stared at the closed door behind them, her mind racing. The house was changing again, shifting its shape, twisting reality around them. There was no logic to it, no pattern. It was chaos, pure and simple. But there had to be a way out. There had to be. She just didn't know if they'd survive long enough to find it. Part 10, A Glimpse of Madness. Maya knelt beside Sarah, her heart pounding as she watched the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Sarah was alive, but barely, her body limp, her pulse weak. Whatever the child thing had done to her, it had almost killed her. Maya wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, her hands shaking as she tried to gather herself. Lucas stood a few steps away, staring at the closed door, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, running a trembling hand through his hair. "What is this place?" Kelly was still on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes wide and red from crying. She rocked back and forth, mumbling incoherently under her breath, her mind on the edge of breaking. "It's not real, it's not real." Maya's heart clenched. They were losing it, Kelly, Lucas, even Sarah, who lay unconscious. She felt it too, the slow unraveling of her mind as the house pressed down on them, warping reality around them, twisting their fears into something tangible, something that wanted to devour them. She forced herself to stand, though her legs felt weak beneath her. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice hoarse. We can't stay here. It's too dangerous. Lucas shot her a disbelieving look, his eyes wide with fear. Move? After that? We should have left when we had the chance. We shouldn't have come in here at all. Maya grabbed his arm, her grip tight. Lucas, listen to me. There's no going back. The house won't let us leave unless we figure this out. We're stuck here, and the only way out is forward. But how? Kelly whimpered, her voice a desperate whisper. There's no end to this place. It keeps changing. It keeps pulling us deeper. Maya didn't have an answer. She wished she did. All she knew was that stopping now, giving in to the terror, to the madness, would mean the house had won. And if the house won, none of them would leave. Ever. She looked at Sarah's unconscious form, her mind racing. We need to find another way out. We can't stay in one place for too long. Sarah stirred slightly, letting out a low groan as she blinked her eyes open, dazed. What happened? Maya knelt beside her, gently helping her sit up. You passed out. We pulled you out of the room. Sarah's eyes were unfocused, her body weak as she tried to sit up straighter. That thing. That child. What was it? We don't know, Maya replied, her voice soft. But we're not staying to find out. We have to keep moving. With a groan, Sarah forced herself to stand, though she leaned heavily on Maya for support. Her legs were shaky, her breathing ragged, but she nodded. Okay. Let's get the hell out of here. The group, battered and exhausted, shuffled down the hallway. The house was strangely still, the oppressive silence only broken by the creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet. The walls were no longer twisting, no longer alive with dark energy. Instead, they seemed lifeless. Like the house was watching, waiting for its next move. Kelly kept close to Maya, her eyes darting nervously toward the walls. Maya, what if it's leading us somewhere? Like before? What if it's trapping us again? Maya's stomach churned at the thought, but she tried to keep her voice steady. We'll find a way out. We just need to stay focused. Lucas, walking behind them, suddenly stopped. Wait. Do you hear that? The group froze, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the heavy, suffocating silence. But then, faintly, they heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something knocking gently against a wooden surface. Maya's pulse quickened. It was the same sound they had heard before, back when the house had first started shifting. The tapping, it meant something. Something was moving. Changing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing off the walls like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. It felt like a heartbeat, steady, relentless, as if the house itself was alive. We need to get out of here, Sarah said, her voice sharp with fear. Now. Maya didn't argue. The group picked up the pace, their footsteps quickening as they hurried down the twisting hallway. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing colder with each passing moment. And then, without warning, the hallway ended. They stood at the edge of a large, open room, a ballroom, by the looks of it. The walls were lined with cracked, decaying mirrors, their surfaces warped and fogged, reflecting distorted images of the group back at them. Dust covered the once elegant chandeliers that hung from the ceiling, their crystals dull and lifeless. The floor was a mess of broken tiles and shattered glass, but it stretched on for what seemed like miles, a vast, desolate space that felt entirely wrong. Maya's stomach dropped. The ballroom was enormous, too big. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't have fit inside the house. But then again, nothing about the house made sense. We shouldn't be here, Lucas muttered, his eyes wide as he took in the warped reflections in the mirrors. This room, it's all wrong. Kelly's voice trembled. What is this place? Maya felt it too, the overwhelming wrongness of the room, the sense that they had crossed some invisible threshold into a place they didn't belong. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was something deeper, something more ancient, more malignant. We have to cross it, Sarah said, her jaw clenched. There's no other way. We need to get to the other side. But as they stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted again. The air grew colder, thicker, as though the room was suffocating them, pressing down on their lungs. The mirrors lining the walls seemed to shimmer, the reflections within them twisting, warping. And then, one by one, the reflections began to move. But none of them were moving. Maya stopped in her tracks, her heart leaping into her throat. Wait. The reflections didn't match their movements. In the mirror closest to her, her reflection stood perfectly still, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Its head cocked to one side, an eerie grin spreading across its face. Maya. Lucas whispered, his voice shaking. What's happening? Kelly let out a soft gasp, backing away from the nearest mirror. Her reflection stood there, grinning at her, its eyes too large, too bright, as though it were mocking her fear. They're not us, Sarah muttered, her voice tight with horror. They're not our reflections. The mirrored versions of themselves grinned wider, their faces twisting into grotesque caricatures of the real thing. They watched with cold, malicious eyes, their bodies unmoving, save for the twisted smiles that grew wider with every passing second. Maya took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. We need to get out of here. But before they could move, the tapping started again, louder this time, more frantic. The mirrors vibrated with each tap, sending ripples through the distorted reflections. The floor beneath them trembled, cracks spreading through the tiles like veins. And then, without warning, the reflections moved. Maya's reflection lunged forward, slamming against the surface of the mirror, its wide, manic eyes locked on her. Its hands pressed against the glass, the grin on its face stretching impossibly wide. Maya! Kelly screamed, backing away as her own reflection began to move, its body convulsing, writhing against the surface of the mirror like it was trying to escape. Sarah grabbed Maya's arm, pulling her back. We need to run. But as they turned to flee, the mirrors shattered, sending shards of glass flying in every direction. The air filled with the deafening sound of breaking glass, the distorted reflections spilling out into the room like shadows coming to life. Maya's blood ran cold as the reflections stood before them, twisted, nightmarish versions of themselves, their faces locked in grotesque grins, their eyes wide with madness. They're us, Lucas whispered, his voice trembling with terror. But they weren't. They were something else, something born of the house, something dark and malevolent that had been waiting for them all along. And now it was coming for them. Run! Maya screamed, grabbing Kelly's hand as they bolted across the ballroom, the shattered reflections chasing after them, their distorted faces grinning madly. The floor buckled beneath them, the tiles cracking and splintering as the shadows of their reflections grew larger, more monstrous. The air was thick with the sound of shattering glass, the broken pieces swirling around them like a storm of jagged edges. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as they reached the far side of the room, where another door waited, barely visible through the haze of dust and debris. She threw it open, shoving Kelly through as the distorted reflections closed in behind them, their twisted laughter echoing through the ballroom. They stumbled into another hallway, slamming the door shut behind them. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. For a moment, no one spoke. They were all too stunned, too terrified to move. Maya leaned against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. What were those things? They were us, Kelly whispered, her voice trembling. But, not. Lucas sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands. This house, it's not just trying to kill us. It's trying to drive us insane. Maya couldn't argue with that. The house wasn't just hunting them, it was breaking them down, piece by piece, warping reality around them until they couldn't tell what was real and what was a nightmare. But one thing was certain. They had to get out. And fast. Part 11, Shadows of the Mind. Maya leaned against the cold, mold-covered wall, her breath heavy and her pulse still racing from the encounter with the reflections. Her legs trembled beneath her, barely able to hold her up. The hallway they had stumbled into was dark, narrower than the others, and the walls seemed to breathe with them, expanding and contracting in the suffocating quiet. She felt the house's pressure more than ever now, closing in on them like a predator savoring its prey. Sarah paced, her hands on her head, trying to calm her breathing. "We're losing it," she muttered, her eyes darting back and forth, filled with panic. I saw my own reflection grinning at me, like it knew what I was thinking. It was me, but it wasn't. Lucas sat against the wall, his face hidden in his hands, rocking back and forth. I can't take this anymore. It's not just the house. It's in us now." Maya's mind raced. The house wasn't just a physical thing anymore, it was inside their heads, warping their thoughts, making them see things that couldn't be real. It was breaking them down from the inside, feeding off their fear, twisting their reality. Her hands clenched into fists as she tried to hold on to any thread of rational thought. Kelly, who had been unusually silent, slowly looked up. Her face was streaked with dried tears, her eyes red and hollow. "Maybe it's us, she whispered. "Maybe we're not even real anymore. Maybe we're just shadows." Her words sent a chill down Maya's spine. They had all seen the impossible, shifting hallways, rooms that didn't fit, creatures and reflections that defied reality. The longer they stayed, the more distorted everything became. It felt like the house was not just changing around them, it was changing them. Maya couldn't shake the thought that maybe Kelly was right, that maybe they had already crossed a line they couldn't come back from. "No," Maya said sharply, pushing the thoughts away. "We're real. This is real. We have to focus. We can't let the house win." Sarah let out a hollow laugh, still pacing. "Win? This place is playing games with us, Maya. It's not a haunted house. It's something else, something ancient and wrong. It wants to tear us apart." Maya looked around the cramped hallway, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The air felt dense, like breathing through a wet cloth. She knew they couldn't stay here much longer. The house would catch up. It always did. "We need to move," Maya said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We're not going to sit here and wait to die." Lucas looked up from where he sat, his face pale and gaunt. "Move where? Every time we move, we just end up back where we started, or worse." Maya nodded, her mind racing for a plan, for some way to keep them going. The house was turning their own minds against them, warping reality itself to trap them. But there had to be a way out. There had to be. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "But staying here, losing our minds, that's what it wants. If we stay here, it wins. We have to keep going." Kelly got to her feet shakily, clinging to Maya for support. "I don't want to be here anymore. Please, Maya, get us out." Maya gave her a nod, though she didn't know if she could keep that promise. "I'll try." Sarah stopped pacing and glanced down the hallway, her face twisted with frustration. "Fine. Let's move. But we need to be careful. That thing in the mirrors? I don't think it's gone." The four of them moved cautiously down the hallway, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the suffocating darkness. The walls around them seemed to twist and ripple like the surface of a dark pool, the mold growing thicker, the smell of rot more overpowering. As they walked, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. She had felt it before, the oppressive presence of the house, but this was different. It was closer now, more intimate, like it was brushing against the edges of their minds, twisting their thoughts. She glanced at the others. They were all pale, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies tense and ready to snap. The hallway led them to a spiral staircase, descending into even deeper darkness. The stairs were old, cracked, and covered in a thick layer of grime. The banister had long since crumbled, and the whole thing seemed ready to collapse. But it was the only way forward. Down, Sarah muttered grimly. Always down. Maya hesitated. Everything inside her screamed that descending was a bad idea, that they were walking straight into the heart of the nightmare. But there was no other choice. We have to, she said softly, more to herself than the others. She glanced at Kelly, whose eyes were wide and terrified, her body trembling. Stay close. We don't know what's down there. They descended slowly, one step at a time, the stairs groaning under their weight. Every creak sent a spike of fear through Maya's chest, her breath quickening as they descended deeper into the dark. The staircase spiraled endlessly, the walls narrowing until it felt like they were walking into the throat of some great beast. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the bottom. The room they stepped into was unlike anything they had seen before. It was cavernous, the ceiling lost in darkness above them. The walls were made of stone, slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the stench of rot and something worse, something metallic and sharp, like blood. In the center of the room was a massive stone table, similar to the altar they had seen before. But this one was larger, more imposing, and the carvings on its surface were deeper, darker. The symbols etched into the stone glowed faintly in the darkness, pulsating with a sickening energy. On the table lay a body. It was hard to tell if it had once been human. The skin was gray and shriveled, stretched tightly over a skeletal frame. Its eyes were hollow sockets, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. The body was bound to the table with thick, rusted chains, and the smell of decay radiated from it like a cloud. Maya's breath caught in her throat. What is this? Sarah stepped closer, her eyes wide with horror. It's a ritual. This is where it ends. Where it always ends. Kelly backed away, her body trembling. We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't have come here. This is where people disappear. Lucas stood frozen, staring at the body on the table. That thing, it's one of the missing people. One of the ones who never made it out. Maya swallowed hard, her mind spinning. This was it. The center of the house. The place where all the nightmares came from. This was where the house had taken the others. And now, it was calling for them. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the room, echoing off the stone walls. Kelly screamed, clutching onto Maya's arm as the floor beneath them began to vibrate, a low hum filling the air. The symbols on the stone table glowed brighter, pulsing with a dark, unnatural light. The chains holding the body rattled violently, and the air grew thick with energy, an energy that felt old and hungry. The house was coming alive. Maya's pulse raced as she backed away from the table, her heart pounding in her chest. We need to get out of here. Now. But before they could move, the body on the table convulsed. Its limbs jerked violently against the chains, and a low, guttural moan escaped from its twisted, grinning mouth. The air grew colder, and the dark light from the symbols flared brighter, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. Run! Sarah screamed, grabbing Kelly and pulling her toward the door. We need to run. But as they turned to flee, the walls around them began to shift, closing in on them, warping like living things. The stone beneath their feet cracked and split, and the body on the table let out another sickening moan, its hollow eyes rolling back in its head. Maya's vision blurred as the room twisted and swayed, the air vibrating with dark energy. The house was alive, feeding off their fear, pulling them deeper into its trap. The whispers returned, louder now, screaming inside their minds. You are ours. You are ours. You are ours. Maya grabbed Lucas's arm, dragging him toward the door as the room closed in around them. We need to get out of here. But the door was gone. The walls had shifted, sealing them in. Trapped. Part 12, Bound to the Darkness. The walls were closing in, warping and shifting like living things, breathing with a malevolent energy that pulsed through the air. Maya's heartbeat thundered in her chest as the dark glow from the symbols on the stone altar intensified, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. The body on the altar convulsed again, its bones creaking, the chains rattling as it jerked violently against its restraints. There was no escape. The door had vanished, the room twisted into a prison of stone and darkness. The house had sealed them in, and the air felt thick with something ancient, something hungry. Kelly was sobbing, her hands shaking as she backed into a corner, her eyes wide with terror. We're trapped, she whispered, her voice breaking. We're trapped. Lucas stared at the glowing altar, his face pale, his breath coming in shallow gasps. That thing, it's not dead. It's waking up. Maya couldn't look away from the body on the altar, her pulse racing as the chains rattled louder. The air around it shimmered with a dark energy, the symbols on the stone glowing brighter, feeding off the fear that filled the room. Whatever was bound to that altar wasn't human anymore, it was something else, something twisted, kept alive by the house's malevolent power. Suddenly, the body let out a low, guttural moan, its head jerking upward, its hollow eyes locking onto them. Maya stumbled back, her skin crawling as she met its gaze. The sockets were empty, but somehow, it was looking at them, as though it could see straight into their souls. The room felt colder, the shadows darker, and the walls seemed to press in tighter, like the house itself was closing around them. We need to stop it, Sarah said, her voice trembling but filled with determination. She was standing near the altar now, her eyes locked on the convulsing body. It's the center of all of this. The house, it's feeding off it, feeding off us. Lucas shook his head, his eyes wild with panic. Stop it? How? We don't even know what this is. Maya's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. The house had been luring them here, guiding them to this moment, feeding off their fear, their confusion. But what was the body on the altar? Was it the final piece of the ritual? Was it the key to stopping the nightmare, or was it something far worse? Before she could answer, the body jerked violently, its back arching off the stone as it let out a scream that was inhuman, a sound that echoed through the room, shaking the very walls. The chains rattled furiously as the symbols on the altar flared with an intense, blinding light. Sarah screamed, stumbling back from the altar. It's waking up. Maya felt the dark energy in the room surge, pressing down on them like a wave, crushing the air from their lungs. The whispers returned, louder, more frantic, filling the room with a cacophony of voices that all said the same thing. We are not done. We are not done. Kelly covered her ears, her face twisted in terror. Make it stop. Please, make it stop. Maya's eyes locked onto the altar. The body was twisting, writhing, the chains pulling tight against its limbs. The symbols carved into the stone were alive with a sickening light, pulsing in rhythm with the thing's movements. It was like the house itself was trying to bring it back to life. Her mind snapped into focus. The house wanted them to finish the ritual. It wanted them to give in, to complete whatever dark offering had been started years ago. But if they did, they'd be trapped forever. Just like the body on the altar. No, Maya muttered, stepping toward the altar. We're not playing your game. Lucas stared at her in disbelief. What are you doing? Maya grabbed a loose piece of broken stone from the floor, her hands trembling. I'm stopping this. Sarah's eyes widened. You can't. You don't know what that thing is. I don't need to, Maya said, her voice trembling but filled with resolve. Whatever this is, it's the center of the house's power. If we destroy it, maybe we can break the hold it has on us. Before anyone could stop her, Maya lifted the stone and brought it down hard on the altar. The impact sent a shock wave of energy through the room, the symbols flaring with light so bright it burned their eyes. The body on the altar let out a piercing scream, its limbs jerking violently as the chains rattled. But Maya didn't stop. She brought the stone down again and again, smashing it into the altar, ignoring the searing pain that shot through her arms, ignoring the screams that filled the air. The dark energy in the room surged, wild and chaotic, the walls trembling as though the house itself was trying to fight back. Lucas ran forward, grabbing another piece of broken stone, joining Maya in smashing the altar. If this works, we're getting out of here, he shouted over the deafening noise, his face twisted in desperation. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before grabbing a shard of stone herself and slamming it into the altar with all her strength. The altar cracked under the impact, and the dark light from the symbols flickered wildly, as though the power of the house was faltering. The body on the altar convulsed violently, its twisted mouth opening in a silent scream, its hollow eyes rolling back into its skull. The chains snapped tight around its limbs, pulling it down as the stone beneath it cracked and split open. Then, with a deafening crack, the altar shattered. The body collapsed into the broken stone, its twisted limbs going limp as the chains fell away. The dark light flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the room into a deep, suffocating silence. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, the energy that had filled the room now gone, as though the house had lost its grip. The whispers were gone. The room was dead silent. Kelly was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. Did we stop it? Maya dropped the stone from her hand, her chest heaving with exhaustion. I don't know. The body on the altar lay still, the grotesque grin finally gone from its twisted face. The room felt different now, empty, hollow. Like the house had lost its power. But Maya knew better than to trust it. This house wasn't going to let them go that easily. Sarah stepped forward cautiously, her eyes locked on the altar. We need to get out of here. Whatever we just did, it's not over. Lucas nodded, his face pale but determined. She's right. We broke the altar, but the house is still here. We have to find a way out. Maya looked around the room, her mind racing. The door they had entered through was still gone, sealed off by the twisting walls. But something had changed. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on them since they'd entered the house was lighter, the air easier to breathe. We're getting out of here, Maya said firmly. We have to. But just as they turned to look for an exit, a low rumbling filled the room. The ground beneath them trembled, and the walls began to ripple, the stone warping and twisting once again. The broken pieces of the altar began to vibrate, and the body on the stone shuddered violently. Lucas backed away, his eyes wide. No. No, 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 it's not over. The body jerked upright, its hollow eyes snapping open, glowing with a sickening, unnatural light. The chains that had fallen away slithered across the floor like snakes, wrapping around the body's limbs once more, pulling it back toward the altar. And then the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room with a deafening roar. You cannot leave. You are ours. You cannot leave. The walls began to close in, the room collapsing around them as the dark energy surged back, stronger than before. The house wasn't done with them. It was never going to let them leave. Maya grabbed Sarah and Kelly, pulling them toward the far wall as the room continued to warp and twist. We need to find a way out. Now. But there was no door, no exit. Just the stone, the altar, and the thing that was no longer human, rising once again. The house was waking up. Part 13, The House's Wrath. The floor trembled beneath their feet, the air thick with the oppressive, suffocating presence of the house. The walls rippled and groaned, warping like flesh beneath their touch, bending the room into a twisted nightmare. The dark energy that had briefly faltered after the altar shattered was surging back, stronger than ever, pulling everything in its grasp deeper into its madness. The body on the altar convulsed violently, its hollow eyes burning with a sick, unnatural light. The chains that had once bound it slithered like living things, crawling back up its skeletal frame, wrapping tighter, as if they were part of the creature now, part of the house itself. The whispers grew louder, reverberating off the walls, crawling inside their minds. "You are ours. You cannot leave. You are ours." Maya gripped Sarah and Kelly's arms, her heart pounding in her chest as the room around them continued to twist, the stone beneath them cracking, the shadows growing longer and darker. The house wasn't just alive, it was angry. Furious that they had tried to defy it. Furious that they had shattered the altar. The brief hope she had felt was gone, replaced by a gnawing terror that consumed her every thought. "We need to move," Maya shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the house. "We can't stay here." But the walls were closing in. The stone ceiling above them groaned and splintered, chunks of rock falling and smashing to the floor with thunderous cracks. The ground beneath their feet seemed to heave and breathe like a living thing. There was no time left. If they didn't find a way out now, the house would crush them, devour them. Sarah looked around wildly, her eyes wide with panic. "There's no door. There's no way out." Lucas stumbled back, his face pale, his eyes locked on the creature that was rising from the altar, its skeletal body jerking and twitching with unnatural movements. We woke it up. The house is it. The whole place is alive." Kelly let out a sob, clutching Maya's arms so tightly it hurt. "We're going to die here. It's not going to let us leave." Maya's mind raced. They were trapped. The creature was rising, and the house itself seemed ready to collapse around them. But there had to be something. There had to be a way out. She refused to believe that this was how it ended, that they were destined to disappear like the others who had entered the house before them. The whispers grew louder, filling her head with a dizzying cacophony of voices, all repeating the same message over and over. "You are ours. You cannot leave." Maya's breath came in ragged gasps as she looked around the room, desperate for any sign of an escape. Her eyes landed on the symbols etched into the walls, still glowing faintly with the sick, pulsing light. The carvings looked older than the house itself, older than anything she had ever seen. They weren't just decoration, they were the key. The house was drawing its power from them, feeding off the dark energy they radiated. "They're connected," Maya shouted, pointing to the symbols. "The symbols. They're controlling everything." Sarah followed her gaze, her eyes narrowing as she realized what Maya was saying. "You think if we destroy them? We have to try." Maya grabbed a shard of broken stone from the floor, her hands shaking. "We need to destroy the symbols. It's the only way." Lucas's face twisted with fear and confusion, but he didn't argue. He grabbed another piece of stone and rushed